a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. Reconstruction and the Lost Cause. Begins. After the end of the Civil War and the outlawing of enslavement, the United States went through a process known as Reconstruction, a period of rebuilding and reuniting the country. 28 Abraham Lincoln had begun this process during the Civil War. 529 But Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 put Reconstruction in the hands of his Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and Republicans in Congress. 530. Johnson was a former Democrat from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union. He disapproved of the Confederacy and wanted to punish wealthy enslavers who participated in it. 31 But he also wanted to keep white people in charge of the South and opposed giving equal political rights to African Americans. 132 As Johnson wrote in an 1868 letter to the governor of Missouri, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." 33. Fought with Republicans in Congress over the direction of Reconstruction and African American civil rights, which eventually led to Johnson's impeachment. 134 Congressional Republicans took over the process of Reconstruction and passed new laws aimed at giving formerly enslaved people basic legal rights. 135. Republicans had several overlapping goals: regrowing the Southern cotton economy, building the ex-Confederate states' governments before allowing them to come back fully into the United States, and making sure that formerly enslaved people could no longer be held in enslavement. 36 Some of the most progressive Republicans, known as Radical Republicans, wanted to completely change social, economic, and political life in the South to support black equality. 37 But moderate and conservative Republicans mostly focused on laws that would give African Americans basic legal and economic rights such as making contracts to work and getting paid for their work. 38 Enslaved and former enslavers in the South had their own goals. Formerly enslaved people wanted more than just basic legal rights. To be independent, out of the control of their former enslavers, and to own small farms where they could work for themselves. 139 They wanted to educate themselves and their children. 40 They wanted the ability to move around in search of family members sold away during enslavement. 541 Finally, they wanted political rights such as the right to vote and hold office. 542 Enslavers refused to acknowledge African Americans' new freedom. In every ex-Confederate state, white Southerners passed laws called Black Codes. 143 Black Codes included vagrancy laws that allowed police to arrest any black person without an employer and force them to work. Black Codes in some states also forced black parents to give control over their children to their former enslavers. State courts generally punished African Americans more harshly than white Americans charged with the same crimes. 544 In Congress would have to force former enslavers in the South to treat the formerly enslaved fairly, equally, and with basic human dignity. Briefly considered passing laws that would take away land from wealthy Confederates and give it to formerly enslaved people so that they could support themselves as independent farmers. 545 Immediately before the end of the Civil War, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands to provide for the welfare of formerly enslaved African Americans, including through issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel, as necessary. Every ex-Confederate state, white Southerners passed laws called the Black Codes. Those include laws that allowed police to arrest any black person without an employer and force them to work. Forced black parents to give control over their children to their former enslavers. Did not allow African Americans to change employers without permission. 78. 2. Immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children, according to the statute. 46 Commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency had the authority to supervise labor relations in the South, with the mandate to provide education, medical care, and legal protections for formerly enslaved African Americans. along with the authority to rent out and eventually sell allotments of abandoned or confiscated land to free African Americans. 547. Original goal of the Freedmen's Bureau Act was the more radical notion of allowing African Americans the means to become self-sufficient. 148 In the closing days of the Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 18, setting aside 400,000 acres of confiscated land for those who had been freed, and 2 months later, the Freedmen Bureau's Act formalized the field order, providing that each Negro might have 40 acres at a low price on long credit. 549 Many free African Americans and Northern Republicans believed that land reform in the South, granting formerly enslaved African Americans access to their own land, was the true way that formerly enslaved people would be free from their enslavers. 150 The resulting independent black farmers would provide a power base for a new social and political order in the post-war South. 551. This new vision of social relations in the South was opposed by white Southerners as well as Northerners who opposed enslavement but did not believe in full equality for African Americans. 152 Most white Americans, even in the North, thought these policies were too radical, because they took away ex-Confederates' individual property rights and set a dangerous precedent that wealth could be redistributed to poorer members of society. 153 Moreover, a large number of black landowners would threaten plantations and disrupt the Southern economy and social system. 54 White capitalists in the North and South believed that black freedom should mean black workers continuing to work on a plantation, although they would now be paid. 155 They did not believe that African Americans should be able to support themselves independently through subsistence farming, which would have led to less cotton being grown and posed a threat to the interests of cotton merchants and other capitalists in the South. Elsewhere in the United States, and in Europe, 556 In less than a full harvest season, the land that Sherman had given to freed persons was returned to the prior owners. 57. Freedmen's Bureau tried to assert and protect the rights of the formerly enslaved. It also perpetuated racist stereotypes, paternalistic attitudes, and continued to limit African Americans' economic and social power. Agents often viewed formerly African Americans as children, unprepared for freedom, and needing to be taught the importance of work and wages. 158 The Freedmen's Bureau abandoned the possibility of land reform in the South, and focused mostly on labor relations between black and white Southerners instead. 559. Republicans' other major Reconstruction policies focused on making sure that formerly enslaved black Southerners had access to basic civil rights, such as rights to make contracts, own property, keep their families together, have physical safety, treated fairly by the courts and the criminal justice system. 560 In 1866, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act that made anyone born in the United States a citizen, without regard to their race, color, or previous enslavement. 61 Newly freed black citizens were supposed to have the same equality under the law, as is enjoyed by white citizens. 562. Americans feared that a federal law like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 could be overturned easily if another political party came into power. They pushed for a constitutional amendment that would make black citizenship and civil rights permanent. 63. 18th Amendment, approved by Congress in 1866 and ratified by the required number of states in 1868, said that any person born in the United States was a citizen, birthright citizenship, that state governments could not take away the life, liberty, or property of any. Judge M.W. Judge Mifflin Wistar Gibbs, 1823-1915, was a prominent civil rights and entrepreneur in San Francisco who fought against California's anti-black laws. Circa 1901-1903. Of Library of Congress. 9. Chapter 2 Enslavement. Citizen or non-citizen, without due process of law, following standard legal procedures, and that the states had to treat every person equally under the law. 164 Black activists had finally won their decades-long battle for birthright citizenship, and all people born in the United States now benefited from their work. 565. Soon decided that formerly enslaved people's legal and economic rights could not be protected unless African Americans had political rights, specifically rights to vote and hold office. 166 The 15th Amendment, approved by Congress in 1869 and ratified by the required number of states in 1870, made it illegal for states to discriminate against voters based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 567 The intention was to stop the states from denying voting rights to African American men. 568 As with the 13th and 14th Amendments, the 15th Amendment gave Congress the power to pass future legislation to ensure that the states followed the law. 569 California rejects Reconstruction civil rights legislation. The legislature and governor of California strongly opposed Congress's Reconstruction civil rights laws and tried to stop them. 570 During the Civil War, Black Californians had fought for and won new rights, such as the right to testify in court cases involving whites. 571 This was because white Republicans controlled the legislature and governorship during the early 1860s and took power away from the pro-slavery Democrats who used to control the state. 572 But many white Californians opposed congressional civil rights laws to protect formerly enslaved people and worried that these laws would apply to other non-white people in the state. 573 Democrats came back into power in California in 1867 by promising white voters that they would fight against Reconstruction and any new law that would make African Americans, Native Americans, or Chinese Americans equal to whites or give them voting rights. 574 Democrats who controlled the state legislature kept this promise when it came time to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. 575 California's legislature ignored the 14th Amendment and never considered it. 576 The legislature voted to reject the 15th Amendment in 1870. 577 Enough other states had ratified the amendments that they became part of the U.S. Constitution without California's approval. 578 Still, California would continue its resistance to Reconstruction civil rights legislation by refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment until 1959, 579 and the 15th Amendment until 1962. 180 California also led the way in establishing the legal defense for segregation during Reconstruction. In 1874, the Supreme Court of California made a destructive decision that the rest of the United States eventually followed. Ward versus Flood, California's Supreme Court justices decided that segregation in the state's public schools did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as black children and white children had equal access to similar schools and educational opportunities. 581 22 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court made a similar, separate but equal, decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The decision supported the segregation of public facilities in the United States for almost 60 years. 82 Construction of Reconstruction African Americans fought for and took advantage of many new legal rights during Reconstruction, but this time period of growing legal equality was short. White supremacist terrorist groups, first the Ku Klux Klan and then later militias such as the White League of Louisiana and the Red Shirts of South Carolina, eventually overthrew the Reconstruction governments that black and white Republicans had established together in the South. 583 For a detailed discussion of African Americans' political accomplishments during Reconstruction and white supremacist terrorism in the U.S. South, see Chapters 3, Racial Terror, and 4, Political Disenfranchisement, of this report. Ward versus Flood, California's Supreme Court justices decided that segregation in the state's public schools did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as black children and white children had equal access to similar schools and educational opportunities. 22 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court made a similar, separate but equal, decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And supported the segregation of public facilities in the United States for almost 60 years. 2. Enslavement. Southern Democrats, who wanted to keep African Americans working on plantations and out of politics, retook control of the southern states. 84 The long and expensive process of Reconstruction lost popularity with white Northerners, and many of them wanted to give up on the project of trying to change the racial, legal, and economic relationships of the South. 585 The U.S. presidential election of 1876, white Northern Republicans abandoned Reconstruction in the South in exchange for keeping control of the presidency of the United States. 186 after the election, Ohio Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and New York Democrat Samuel Tilden both claimed to be the winner. 187 It was well known that white Southerners had used violence, threats, and fraud to keep African Americans from voting for the Republican Hayes. 88 The national leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties made a secret deal. In exchange for Democrats acknowledging Hayes's victory in the presidential election, Republicans would reduce federal support for Reconstruction. 189 Soon after Hayes became president in 1877, he pulled U.S. troops out of key areas in the South where they had been protecting African Americans' political rights and Republican officeholders. 590 Hayes' action effectively ended direct federal protection of African Americans' political rights in the South. 591 Supreme Court played its own important role in defeating Reconstruction. 592 In the 1870s, the court made several decisions that greatly reduced the power of the 14th Amendment and federal laws to protect black equality. 93 Last of these decisions happened in the 1883 civil rights cases, a group of several cases that African Americans had brought under the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875. 594 That act had made it illegal for theaters, hotels, and public transportation companies such as railroads to exclude African Americans. 595 Supreme Court decided in 1883 that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional because the 14th Amendment, on which it was based, only gave Congress to stop state governments from discriminating against African Americans. Congress could not outlaw individual people and private business owners from discriminating against African Americans, only the state governments themselves could do that. 96 Supreme Court decision in the civil rights cases legalized racial discrimination and segregation in most public places. It set the stage for the separate but equal decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, and practices such as housing discrimination and education segregation. 197 of the lost cause myth. Reconstruction ended. White Southerners created the myth of the Confederate lost cause in order to downplay the horrors of enslavement and terrorize African Americans. 198 Southerners who opposed black civil rights falsely argued that the Civil War had little to do with enslavement. Lost cause myth claims that the Confederacy had fought a heroic war to save the Southern way of life from being destroyed by the North. 99 This untruthful history also claims that the Confederacy lost the Civil War only because the more populated, industrialized North overpowered white Southerners, not because enslavement or the Confederate cause was wrong. 600 Cause is not just a story that white Southerners tell. It is a weapon of terror against African Americans and a rejection of the Southern defeat in the Civil War and black civil rights. At the end of the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, white Southerners began building thousands of monuments and statues all over the South to celebrate famous Confederates, and to name important buildings after Confederate figures. 601 In the 1910s, the Ku Klux Klan, which the federal government had broken up during Reconstruction, re-emerged and began terrorizing and murdering African Americans. The combination of violence against African Americans and the constant sight of monuments celebrating the enslaving Confederacy were terrorist tactics meant to silence African Americans and keep them from challenging white supremacy. 602 Cause symbols became especially important to white Southerners who tried to stop the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. White Southerners who opposed African American civil and human the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, white Southerners began building thousands of monuments and statues all over the South to celebrate famous Confederates, and to name important buildings after Confederate figures. Californians also built Confederate monuments across the state. 1. To enslavement. Beat and murdered black and some white civil rights activists. Also began regularly flying versions of the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Stars and Bars, popularly known as the Confederate flag, to threaten civil rights activists and to show that they were determined not to give equality to African Americans. 103 Even though defenders of the lost cause have argued that Confederate monuments and flags stand for heritage, not hate, and they claim that removing them erases history, this argument ignores the true history of these objects. Southerners have used them strategically as symbols of terror to try and keep African Americans from fighting for full equality. 604 California and the Lost Cause. California, white Americans popularized the Lost Cause mythology with national audiences. The film industry was responsible for bringing the Lost Cause to movie screens and making it popular with many white Americans, North and South, during the first half of the 1900s. 605. W. Griffith's blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation, 1915, falsely showed members of the Ku Klux Klan as heroes who were protecting white women and Southern honor against violent African Americans, mostly played by white actors who painted their faces black. Was the main factor behind the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s. 606 Gone with Wind, 1939, celebrated the pre-Civil War South by showing a world of kindly enslavers, loyal and happy enslaved people, and heroic Confederates fighting for the Southern way of life. 607. Californians also built Confederate monuments across the state. Example, a plaque honoring Confederate President Jefferson Davis, set up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, stood along a Bakersfield, California, highway for almost 80 years. 608A monument in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, California, built in 1925, celebrated all Confederates who died on the Pacific Coast. 609 Although both of these monuments have now been removed, their existence reminds us of California's complicity in the United States' long history of enslavement, white supremacist terrorism, and systemic racism against African Americans. Conclusion. To steal and profit from the labor of millions of human beings for 244 years, the colonial American and U.S. governments built an institution of enslavement that was markedly different from the type of slavery that the world had seen before. Passed laws that enshrined a racial hierarchy with white people at the top and black people at the bottom. Was based on the false idea that all white people were naturally superior in intelligence and morality to all black people, and white Americans then used these ideas to justify the lifelong enslavement of people of African ancestry and their descendants. American law enslaved babies from the moment they were born, through adulthood, until the moment they died, and ensured that all their descendants suffered the same fate. Certain time periods, state governments even passed laws that made it illegal for enslavers to voluntarily free enslaved people from bondage. Enslavement was a badge pinned on people of African descent because of the color of their skin. Slavery formally ended in 1865, this racial hierarchy continued functioning. Reconstruction and the rise of the Lost Cause brought a long period of political, social, economic, and legal inequality for African Americans that white people enforced through terrorism, violence, and exploiting legal loopholes. It was known as Jim Crow, after a racist stereotyped character popular with white Americans, and it lasted roughly 60 to 70 years, from the 1890s to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Laws that made enslavement legal, American citizens, aided by government officials, terrorized, murdered, and abused their black neighbors to maintain this legacy of slavery, as discussed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror. During this period, white Southerners gradually took Hollywood film industry was responsible for popularizing white supremacist movies, like The Birth of a Nation, during the first half of the 1900s. This film was the main factor behind the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1900s. 2. Enslavement. Black Southerners' rights to vote by using violent intimidation against and legal loopholes such as literacy tests and poll taxes to disqualify black voters, as discussed in Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement. Black people fled violence and oppression in the rural South to find economic opportunity in the North and the West. Government officials maintained the racial hierarchy by putting up barriers to prevent black and white Americans from living in the same neighborhoods. Discussed in Chapter 5, Housing segregation, and allowing private companies to prevent black and white Americans from holding the same jobs, as discussed in Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. Systems of forced labor, such as convict leasing, sharecropping, and debt peonage kept formerly enslaved African Americans working for white Americans on cotton plantations or in other industries, as discussed in Chapter 10. Much of this forced labor rested on discrimination in law enforcement, judicial decisions, and prison sentencing that doomed African Americans to slavery-like conditions, as discussed in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. Actions relegated African Americans to mostly urban neighborhoods with underfunded schools, as discussed in Chapter 6, separate and unequal education, and menial and service jobs. U.S. Supreme Court decisions such as the civil rights cases 1883 and Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 excluded African Americans from using public facilities such as schools on equal terms with white Americans and validated discrimination in housing that excluded African Americans from desirable. These legal decisions and violent practices caused direct physical harm to African Americans by segregating them in polluted, unhealthy neighborhoods, as discussed in Chapter 7, Racism in Environment and Infrastructure, and denying them equal access to quality health care. In Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect. Hierarchy that laws created during enslavement also created deeply harmful and untrue racial stereotypes, which have followed African Americans throughout American history, as discussed in Chapter 9, Control over Spiritual, Creative and Cultural Life. Qualities in the criminal justice system, child welfare laws, housing, and healthcare harmed the survival of black families, as discussed in Chapter 8, Pathologizing the Black Family, while discriminatory. Predatory banking practices and employment discrimination prevented many African Americans from accumulating generational wealth to pass down to their children, as discussed in Chapter 13, The Wealth Gap. 400 years of discrimination has resulted in an enormous and persistent wealth gap between black and white Americans, as discussed in Chapter 13, The Wealth Gap, and continuous and compounding harm on the health of African Americans, as discussed in Chapter 12. Physical harm and neglect. The following chapters will show these effects of slavery continue to be embedded in American society today and have never been sufficiently remedied. Governments of the United States and the state of California have never apologized or compensated African Americans for these harms. White Man's Government, 1868. Thomas Nast, Library of Congress. This page intentionally left blank.